$6,000 in credit card debt, a car falling apart, and one impossible choice. She picked the car. Here's why the math backed her up. She'd been sitting in that parking lot for 20 minutes when she finally let herself look at both balances at the same time. Card A, $4,233. Card B, $1,820. She read the total, $6,053, and her mouth moved around the number without making a sound, like saying it quietly enough might make it less real. The engine shuddered beneath her. That low tremor, she'd started timing at red lights, counting how long before it smoothed out again. It was taking longer every time. Outside, the sodium lights turned everything orange and flat, and the strip mall behind her was mostly dark. And she was alone in a car that might not survive the month, with a phone telling her how much she owed. Here's what made it impossible. She didn't have one problem, she had three, and they were all holding each other up like a bad structure you can't pull a single piece from. The cards were bleeding roughly $150 a month in interest alone, money gone before she paid for a single meal. The car was making sounds that mechanics charge real money to diagnose. And her emergency fund, the thing standing between her and total freefall, was $1,100, barely enough for one of those two crises, not both. She kept running the sequence forward in her head, and it always collapsed at the same point. Which one do you fix when you can only fix one? And what happens to everything else while you wait? February was when she stopped looking away. She'd been paying minimums for almost a year. Not ignoring the cards exactly, just not reading them the way you don't read the terms on something you've already signed. Then, one Sunday, she printed both statements and spread them flat on the kitchen table under the overhead light and got out the cheap calculator she'd had since high school. Card A, $4,233 at 28.24%. Card B, $1,820 at 28.99. She punched in the math on the interest, and the number that came back was $47.80 a month. Almost $150 every single month, not reducing what she owed by a single dollar. She wrote it down. She circled it. She sat with it for a long time. She built the whole picture that night, column by column on a legal pad. Rent, $1,300, gone $150. Phone, $70. Insurance, $70. That was $1,690 before she bought groceries, before she paid $1 toward the cards, before anything went wrong. Her take-home was $2,500. She stared at the gap, $810, and felt something close to vertigo. Because she'd always known it was tight, but she'd never seen it written out like that. Every number in a row, the whole truth of the month on a single page. There wasn't fat in this budget. There was barely muscle. Any one thing going sideways, a medical bill, a bad month of hours, a car repair, and the column didn't balance. The first big payment felt like finally doing the thing. She'd been at the campus library on a Wednesday afternoon in early March, textbooks stacked to her left, the financial aid portal open in one tab and Capital One in another. $650 toward Card A. She typed the amount twice before she submitted it, like she was giving herself a chance to back out. When the confirmation screen loaded, she exhaled through her nose and sat back in her chair and let herself feel it, just for a minute. Progress. Real progress. The balance on Card A dropped to $3,583, and she thought, if I do this every month, I am out in 5 months, maybe 6. It was the kind of math that makes you feel briefly like a genius. She didn't know yet what March was about to bring. It was Deja who first named what Paloma was doing. Break room on a Thursday, the vending machine humming its low, continuous hum, Paloma eating leftover rice and beans from a Tupperware she'd washed 3 times that week. Deja sat down across from her, tall and easy in that yellow hoodie, and looked at the container and said, "You've been bringing lunch every single day." Not a question, the way some people state things when they already know the answer. Paloma told her about the cards, the balances, the interest math, the aggressive payment plan she'd started, and Deja listened with her chin in her hand and didn't say anything until the end. Then she said, "You're doing it the hard way." And something in the way she said it, almost impressed, a little rueful, made Paloma feel seen for the first time in months. The car stopped being just her problem on a Tuesday morning in late March. Paloma was half awake in the kitchen when she heard the keys lift off the hook by the door, that small metallic sound, and looked up to see her mother Marisol, already dressed for the day. Floral blouse tucked in, handbag on her arm, The kind of careful put together that means someone is nervous about being seen. Marisol had gotten her license 4 months earlier, at 48 years old, after 2 decades of depending on buses and other people's schedules. And the way she held those keys, a little formal, a little like she still couldn't believe she was allowed, it caught Paloma somewhere soft. She hadn't thought about what it meant for her mother to have access to the car. She thought about it now. If something happened to the Civic, it wasn't just Paloma's commute that disappeared. She told herself it was the road. Late April, a red light on Meridian, and the car shuddered so hard the rearview mirror actually moved. A short, violent tremor, like something had slipped loose underneath. Paloma's hands tightened on the wheel and she held very still, the way you go still when you're hoping something will pass. It passed. The light went green. She drove the next 4 blocks watching the temperature gauge and listening for sounds and telling herself it was probably nothing, probably just the cold still working its way out of the engine, probably the road surface. She pulled into the gas station on the corner and sat in a pump lane for 10 minutes, not pumping gas. She wasn't ready to open the hood. She wasn't ready to know. Tito put it on the lift and spent 15 minutes under there without saying much, which Paloma already knew was bad. She stood in the shop watching his legs move around under the car while the air wrench went in another bay, and she rehearsed numbers in her head. Not the repair number, she didn't know it yet. The other numbers, the ones she'd have to move to make room for whatever this was going to be. He came out, wiped his hands on a rag, and told her straight. Torque converter slipping, probable transmission fluid leak. She'd want this fixed, right, and not halfway. He wrote the estimate on the clipboard and turned it toward her. $1,600 to $1,800. Paloma looked at the number and wrote it in the small notebook she kept in her jacket pocket and said, "Okay, just that." Tito watched her write it down and didn't say anything else. She was almost out the door when he said it. "If you wait on this, the number doubles." Not a warning exactly, the way mechanics say things that are true, so often they've stopped inflecting them. Paloma nodded and kept walking, and the sentence filed itself away somewhere below the layer where she was actively thinking, next to the estimate, next to the balance on card A, next to the $1,100 sitting in her savings account. She sat in the waiting room for a few minutes before she called for her ride, the repair estimate sitting face down on her knee because she couldn't look at it again yet. An air wrench fired somewhere in the back. She watched the door to the shop floor and thought about the $1,100 and what it would leave behind it if she spent it. What she hadn't done yet was think about what waiting would actually cost. That part would take longer. She told herself she was just looking. The dealership was on Route 9, the kind of lot that's all glass and flags and cars angled just so in the morning light. And Paloma drove there the next day on her lunch break thinking she'd run the numbers and rule it out, and that would be the end of it. Rourke found her in under 3 minutes. Sandy side part, short sleeve shirt, lanyard swinging, and he walked her to a 2018 Corolla with 61,000 miles and called it practically new. $9,400. After her trade-in, it came to $87 a month less than she'd feared, $187 for 60 months. And she made herself hear that number the way he said it. Small, manageable, sensible. She nodded along and kept her arms crossed and did not ask the follow-up question until she was back in the Civic driving home. The follow-up question was simple. $187 on top of what? She ran it on her phone at the first red light. $600 minimum toward the cards. She'd been paying more, but $600 was the floor she'd set. Fixed costs at $1,690. The car payment. She got to $2,577 before she'd paid for a single meal, and her take-home was $2,500. The new car didn't solve anything. It moved the debt from one column to another, spread it thinner, added 60 months of interest she hadn't priced yet, and left her with less margin than she had right now. Today, in a car she already owned free and clear. She drove the rest of the way home without the radio on, just the math running on a loop, and somewhere around the last 4 blocks, she stopped hoping the replacement was the answer. It wasn't, which meant the only thing left was the repair. And she had $1,100. Her emergency fund sat at $1,100, and she'd been telling herself for weeks it was enough to feel safe. It wasn't a cushion, really. It was a number she'd decided to believe in. She opened the banking app and just looked at it. $1,100. Tito's lower estimate was $1,600. Even his floor was $500 more than everything she had set aside. She set the phone face down on the table and didn't pick it up again for 20 minutes. What scared her most wasn't the gap. It was what wiping that number to zero meant. One sick day, one parking ticket, one anything, and there was nothing between her and the credit cards she was already trying to climb out of. Then Beto got sick. It started with 2 days of him not touching his food, which she told herself was nothing, and then his stomach went hard, and she knew it wasn't nothing. The 24-hour vet was 40 minutes away, and she sat in the waiting room until 2 in the morning, watching a man with a lab across the aisle and trying not to calculate anything. The bill came to $340. She paid it without blinking, and there was no version of that night where she didn't. But she felt the emergency fund drop in real time, like a number on a screen she wasn't looking at. On the drive home, she texted Deja one-handed at a red light. "I cannot catch a break." She didn't expect an answer. She just needed to say it out loud to someone. She almost just let it go. That's the part she's not proud of. The week after the vet bill, she opened both card accounts, typed in the minimums, $62 on one, $45 on the other, and submitted them before she could think too hard about it. It felt like setting something down that was too heavy. She told herself she'd reassess in a month, which is what people say when they've quietly decided to stop. The legal pad with her payoff plan was right there on the desk, the numbers in her own handwriting, and she didn't look at it. She lay on her bed in the dark and stared at the ceiling and let herself believe, for one night, that the plan was someone else's problem. Marisol called on a Tuesday evening, and Paloma could hear right away that something was off. Her mother's voice had that particular careful quality, the one she used when she was trying not to worry Paloma but was already worried herself. The car had stalled, twice. Once on Meridian, once in the lot of the community college where her English class met, and she'd sat there for 15 minutes, waiting for it to turn over. She'd made it home, she said. She was fine. Paloma gripped the edge of the kitchen counter and didn't say anything for a moment, because the car had just gone from being her financial problem to being her mother's safety problem, and those were not the same thing at all. She called Tito the next morning from the parking lot before she went inside for her shift. She'd written down what she wanted to say. "I have $1,100 now. I can pay the rest in 60 days. I want to book the repair." She didn't read from the notes, but having them written made her voice stay even. Tito was quiet for a second, then said he could work with that. First installment up front. Balance due when she had it. No interest, no penalty, just a date. She thanked him and hung up and stood there, for a moment looking at the Civic in its spot with one hand in her jacket pocket. She'd negotiated a payment plan on her own with a mechanic she'd met once, and it had worked, and she hadn't made it weird. That was a small thing. She let it be a small, good thing. The car was in Tito's shop for 4 days, and those 4 days were a logistical puzzle she solved by not sleeping quite enough. Deja lent her the car without being asked twice. She just said, "Take it, I can carpool with Marcus." And that was that. Paloma woke at 5:30 every morning to add 25 minutes to the commute, drank her coffee from a travel mug wedged in the cup holder, and got to the office before most of her coworkers unlocked the door. She didn't miss a single overtime shift. She told herself she wouldn't let the repair cost her any more than it already had. She wasn't going to let the solution become a second problem. The bill came in at $1,780. Top of the estimate, she'd known it might. Tito had told her the fluid leak could go either way once he got inside it, but knowing didn't make the number easier. She counted out the cash from her savings in her apartment that morning, $1,100 in 20s and 50s, and put it in an envelope. Standing at the shop's front counter, she handed it to Tito. He counted it without comment and gave her a receipt. She folded it in half and put it in her jacket pocket. Her emergency fund was zero. She knew the exact number because she'd watched it land there the night before. Zero has a particular feeling, not panic, but something thinner, like standing at the edge of a room with no furniture and realizing how large the room is. She picked the car up on a Friday evening. Tito pulled it around front himself and left it running at the curb with the door open, the way they do when they want you to hear it. She listened before she even sat down. No shudder, just the engine, steady and low, the way it had sounded the first year she'd owned it. She got in, pulled the door shut, and sat there, with her hands in her lap for almost a full minute. She didn't turn the radio on. She didn't check her phone. She just listened to the idle, that small mechanical fact of it holding steady, and let herself feel something she hadn't felt since February, which was that one thing in her life had been fixed and was staying fixed. July came and she went back to full payments. $700 toward Card A, the first week of the month, the same day her direct deposit landed. She'd started treating the payment like rent, something that left her account before she could think about spending it elsewhere. She opened a notes app and started a column. Date, balance, amount paid. She updated it every Friday. The numbers moved differently than they had on minimums. On minimums, the balance barely breathed. Now it actually dropped. Not dramatically, not the way a fantasy number drops, but in real, concrete chunks that she could track from week to week. That motion felt like proof of something. She needed the proof. She added it up one evening in August. Every interest charge since February, 1 month at a time, the ones she'd let herself not think about too hard while they were happening. $847 in 7 months. She wrote it on the legal pad and circled it twice, not because she wanted to dwell on it, but because she needed it to be a real number and not a vague bad feeling. It wasn't shame exactly. It was more like finally seeing the shape of the thing she'd been fighting. $847 hadn't gone anywhere useful. No principal paid down, no balance reduced, nothing bought. It had just kept her account open while she tread water. Now she knew the enemy's name, and knowing it, she realized, made it smaller, not larger. Deja asked about the car situation sometime in late August, the way a good friend asks, not to follow up, but because she'd actually been wondering. Paloma walked her through the whole thing, the estimate, the dealership math, the zero emergency fund, the 4 mornings she'd driven Deja's car in the dark. Deja listened without interrupting, which was not always her style. When Paloma finished, Deja said, "That's not dumb, that's triage." She said it the way you say something when you mean it, without trying to make it sound like a compliment. The word landed differently than Paloma expected. Triage. Not a mistake she'd survived. A decision she'd made. She filed that word away and kept it. On the drive home that evening, she thought about what Tito had said back in April. If you wait on this, the number doubles. She'd stored it like a fact without fully understanding it yet. But sitting in traffic with the Civic running smooth and quiet under her, she heard it differently. He hadn't been talking about transmissions. He'd been talking about every corner she'd ever cut on a problem because the problem scared her. Every minimum payment. Every "I'll deal with it next month." Waiting in her life had never made anything cheaper. It had always made it worse, and she'd just been calling the worst version later. Like that made it her future self's fault instead of a choice she was making right now. She wasn't going to call it later anymore. August came in hot, and Paloma picked up 3 extra overtime shifts in a single week. Tuesday, Thursday, and the Saturday overnight she'd been turning down for months. The extra hours put $340 above her normal take-home, and she didn't let it sit in checking for more than 48 hours. She sent every dollar of it to Card B. Not some of it, all of it. The balance dropped to $980, and she watched the app reload twice just to make sure the number was real. She'd never sent a payment that large without planning it for weeks, and it felt less like discipline and more like something finally clicking, like she'd stopped asking the debt for permission to fight it. She called her mother that Sunday folding laundry, phone on speaker on the nightstand, and somewhere between sorting socks and matching pillowcases, she told Marisol everything. The 2 cards, the balances, the car repair, the week her emergency fund hit 0. She'd kept most of it to herself, all year. Not out of shame exactly, but because explaining it felt like admitting she hadn't had it handled. Marisol went quiet in a way that wasn't judgment. It was the quiet of someone recalculating. Then she said she didn't know. And then, softer, that she was sorry about the car, sorry she'd been borrowing it without understanding what it cost. Paloma almost said it was fine. Instead, she just said, "I know, Mom." Paloma set the folded shirt down and sat on the edge of the bed. And she said it out loud for the first time, like she actually meant it. Fixing the car was right. Not because it felt right in March when she was staring at a 0 balance, but because losing the car would have meant losing overtime, which would have meant losing the payments, which would have meant losing the year. The whole chain held because the car held. She'd spent 9 months half believing that she'd made the coward's choice, that a smarter person would have found another way. Saying it to her mother out loud to another person who loved her, that was the moment she stopped carrying it like a mistake. The Capital One notification came on a Tuesday evening while she was on the couch doing nothing in particular, the kind of alert she'd trained herself to dread. But it wasn't a late fee or a rate adjustment. Her credit limit on Card B had been increased without her asking. Flagged automatically by an algorithm that had apparently been watching her make on-time payments for 9 straight months. Her score had held at 730. She read the notification twice, set the phone face down on the cushion beside her, and didn't move for a long moment. She didn't open the app. She didn't think about what she could charge. She just sat there in the stillness of knowing that the system had finally registered her as someone who was winning. She drove to Tito's shop in September to pay off the remaining $680 installment. She'd budgeted it into October but moved it up because she was tired of it existing. Tito was behind the counter when she came in, reading glasses on, flipping through an invoice, and he didn't make a thing of it. She wrote the check and slid it across. He looked at it, nodded once, and said almost offhand, "Most people never call back." Just that. She folded her copy of the receipt and put it in her jacket pocket and walked out to the car. She thought about it the whole drive home. Not with pride exactly, but with the specific weight of being someone who followed through when no one was checking. October, card B. Balance sat at $810 at the start of the month, and Paloma sent $700 in a single payment, the largest she'd ever made, larger than her rent check felt the first time she wrote it on her own. The confirmation loaded, and she watched the remaining balance recalculate to $110. She sat at the kitchen table for a while without opening anything else, the legal pad beside her dense with the old numbers crossed out and rewritten, months of small fights made visible in blue ink. She hadn't celebrated any of this year. Not the car repair, not the first month she hit her payment goal, not any of it. Maybe this one deserved a minute. She made herself a cup of tea and let the numbers sit there on the screen. November. She ran the numbers at her desk, and the combined balance came out to $3,940. For the first time all year, the total had a 3 in front of it. She wrote it on a fresh page of the legal pad in large, deliberate numbers, underlined it once, and taped it to the wall above her monitor. She'd had the payoff plan up there since January, but had been avoiding looking at it directly, the way you avoid a mirror when you already know what you'll see. This was different. This was her looking at it. Card B was almost gone. Card A had 9 months left on her current pace. The runway was real, and she'd built it herself, one shift and one payment at a time, out of a year that had no right to go this well. She opened the legal pad to a clean page and worked the forward projection out longhand. Card B gone by January, Card A at roughly $100 entering the new year. Clear by October if nothing broke. 12 months ago, she hadn't been able to see past the end of the week. Now she was writing projected balances 14 months out, and the numbers made sense, followed each other, told a story with an actual ending. She did not feel rich. She did not feel fixed. But she felt like someone who understood her own situation clearly for the first time. And that was the real shift. The one that didn't show up on any statement, but changed how every decision after it felt. Here's what she learned without ever being taught it. In a tight budget, your income is the load-bearing wall. Everything else, the payments, the savings, the plan, lives inside the structure that income holds up. She hadn't fixed the car because she was avoiding her debt. She fixed it because without it, she couldn't earn. And without earning, there was nothing left to fight with. That distinction sounds obvious when you say it out loud. It isn't obvious at 11 p.m. in a shuddering car with $6,000 in high-interest debt and an emergency fund that barely covers 1 month's crisis. The people who make it through don't always make the elegant choice. They make the one that keeps the machine running. She didn't start this year with a framework or a strategy. She started it sitting alone in a cold parking lot, watching an engine shake, adding up a number she didn't want to say out loud. Every good number that followed, the $3,940 balance, the 730 score, the 12-month runway, came from one decision made in the dark with incomplete information and real fear. That is usually how it goes. The people who tell you about their wins rarely lead with how uncertain the first move felt. Paloma would tell you it felt like guessing. It felt like choosing between two versions of losing. And it was still the right call. Not because she knew that then, but because she kept showing up after. If any part of Paloma's year sounds familiar, the tight math, the choice with no clean answer, the month you sent only the minimum and told yourself you'd fix it next month, that's not an accident. That's just what it looks like before it turns. She didn't have a course, or a calculator app, or anyone who'd been through it to walk her through it. If you want to actually understand the framework behind decisions like this one, the first lesson of Greedskingdom is free, and it's linked below. No pitch, no pressure, just the door open. Start there or don't. Either way, the next move is yours. When you had to choose between two bad options with your money, which one did you pick and did it work out?